Warning: the Curious Native podcast contains mature topics and themes that are intended for an older youth and adult audience. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey, welcome to the Curious Native Podcast. I'm your host, hunnasmak, and in today's episode, we are going to be talking about the history of sundown towns, what they are, and why they exist. So if you're interested in hearing that, please keep on listening. Well, for starters, what are sundown towns? Sundown towns are communities in the United States that have historically excluded people of color, particularly and specifically African Americans, through a combination of discriminatory laws, policies, and practices. The term sundown towns refers to the practice of posting signs at the town borders that warned African Americans to leave before sundown or face violence or arrest. While the practice of posting signs is no longer common, many communities continue to be racially segregated and excluded uh, through a variety of means. Sundown towns have a long and troubling history in the United States. They emerged in the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries as a response to the Great Migration. I apologize. It is so freaking hot. In which millions of African Americans left the South to seek better economic opportunities in the North and West regions of the United States. Many white communities responded to the influx of African Americans by enacting discriminatory laws and policies such as zoning laws that prohibited the construction of homes or businesses in certain areas by engaging in acts of violence and intimidation. Sundown towns were particularly common in the Midwest and West, where many communities and had relatively small African American populations and were able to maintain racial segregation through a combination of legal and extra legal means. In many cases, African Americans were excluded from jobs, housings, and other opportunities, which further reinforced the racial divide. For those who lack critical thinking skills, this is for you. Why are sundown towns so bad? There are many reasons why sundown towns are bad. First and foremost, they are a violation of basic human rights and are fundamentally unjust. They deny people of color the opportunity to live, work, and thrive in certain areas, which uh, can have a profound impact on their economic, social, physical, and mental well-being. I apologize. I'm looking through my notes and it's just like, wow. Sundown towns also perpetuate racial stereotypes and contribute to a culture of intolerance and discrimination. They send a message that people of color are not welcome in certain communities, which can lead to feelings of isolation and marginalization. This can have a long-term negative effects on the mental health and well-being of people of color, as well as their economic and social opportunities. Finally, sundown towns contribute to the broader culture of racism and discrimination that has profound social and economic consequences. They perpetuate a system of inequality that has deep roots in American history and that continues to shape the lives of people. The first legal sundown towns in the U.S. Was reportedly Anna, Illinois, which passed an ordinance in 1909 prohibiting African Americans from being present within city limits after sunset. The ordinance was later ruled unconstitutional, but it set a precedent for other towns to follow. The second legal sundown town in the U.S. was reportedly Pierce City, Missouri, which passed an ordinance in 1933 prohibiting African Americans from being present within city limits after sunset. The ordinance was enforced by local police and vigilante groups. We'll touch more on that in a bit. Who would stop and harass black people who were found in the town after dark? Many black people were forced to flee the town, and those who remained faced constant harassment and violence. To further showcase the bigotry of sundown towns and particularly the dangers, let's talk about Carol Jenkins. Carol Jenkins was an African American woman who was murdered on September 16, 1968, by two white men in a sundown town in Indiana. Her murder remained unsolved for over 30 years until a tip led investigators to one of her alleged killers in the early 2000s. Her alleged killer, alleged, I put with quotations Um, his daughter did. His daughter confirmed it. I'm just gonna say, and I'm gonna say it. He was the killer. And if I get sued, so be it. I ain't got nothing for you to take anyways. Kenneth Clay Richmond, who was affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan, I did mention earlier, we'll touch more on that, so just keep listening, was declared incompetent to stand trial and died of bladder cancer in 2002. His accomplice was never identified. In September 1968, 20-year-old Carol, dressed in a white cotton turtleneck, a pair of olive green wool pants, a brown jacket, and a bright yellow scarf, embarked on her first day of selling encyclopedias door to door. To impress her boss, she volunteered to go to Martinsville, Indiana. Martinsville was known to be a sundown town, yet Carol thought she would be safe, as she would be traveling there with 3 co-workers, 2 white men and a 19-year-old black woman. While on her route, 2 white men in a car began following her, catcalling at her and hurling racist slurs at her. She approached the home of young white married couple Dawn and Norma Neal, which they later did face harassment, constant death threats, and just harassment from racist people who were mad that they ended up trying to help Carol. So, with that being said, seeking help, asking them, please. Oh, this is a quote. This is a quote of Carol knocking on the door and asking for help. Quote, please let me in. I've got somebody following me. End quote. The Neals called police out to their residence. The police reported that they tracked down 2 locals who admitted to following her, but admitted to nothing else. Norma Neal walked several blocks with Carol looking for her co-workers. When they could not find them, Neal offered to let Carol stay at the residence. Carol turned down the offer, saying that she did not want to trouble them further. Around 8:30 p.m., Carol then walked off, heading to the predetermined point where she was supposed to meet her co-workers to head back to Rushville. Approximately 15 to 30 minutes later, 2 men got out of their car and chased her down. Her arms were held back from behind by one man, while the other man stabbed her with a screwdriver in her heart. The men left her in the street, bleeding out from the wound where she died. Carol's father insisted that due to the racist past of Martinsville, the police should bring in the FBI to help investigate, but the police refused. The police refused. David would later say, I felt that because she was a black girl, nobody did anything. In June 2000, Carol's mother, Elizabeth, received an anonymous phone call from someone revealing the name of the killer. Elizabeth told Paul, who dipped into his retirement savings, to hire a private investigator to look into it. After the Indiana police got wind of Paul's efforts, they assigned 2 cold case investigators to look into the murder. In November 2001, the investigators received an anonymous letter naming the killer, Kenneth Clay Richmond. The letter also said that Richmond's daughter, Shirley, had witnessed the murder. Like I mentioned earlier, she did say she's seen it. I'm not going to get into details of the murder. I did already mention a little bit, but this is not a true crime podcast, and even then, I do feel a lot of true crime podcasts are just particularly disgusting. I do love it when they bring light to cases that nobody was looking. They just didn't care. I do love that, but I'm not going to get into it.
Court documents say 70-year-old Kenneth Richmond had a pronounced dislike for black people. Do you still dislike black people? Police say he proved it by stabbing 21-year-old Carol Jenkins in the chest on a Martinsville street. The crime occurred on September 16, 1968. It remained unsolved until Richmond's own daughter provided information. She was only 7 years old at the time of the crime, and her father paid her $7 not to tell her mother about what happened.
33 years is a long time, and sometimes people don't want to remember or don't feel it's safe to remember. And I would encourage anybody that's hearing this broadcast to come forward. No lead is too small.
Jenkins' family is thankful a suspect is in custody.
I am really relieved, and I'm just more or less, I just don't know what to say. I'm glad that someone worked as hard as they did, to get this over with. It's not over yet, but I do know that who it is, and I can look at other people and realize they are not the ones that touched my daughter.
State police detectives never gave up.
When there's not that hope, or that it's so very small, that we do the things necessary to find it. And this was one we felt very, very adamant that we need to find closure to.
As you can see, sundown towns are not only dangerous in the economic and social sense, but also when it attains to the life of black people and other people of color. Also, I kept mentioning the KKK and other vigilante groups and them being involved in all of this. So let's get into it a bit and talk about the KKK and sundown towns. The Ku Klux Klan, aka the KKK, played a significant role in the establishments and enforcement of sundown towns in the United States. The KKK is a white supremacist organization that was founded in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it quickly became a powerful force in many parts of the country. In the early 20th century, the KKK began to focus its efforts on promoting and enforcing racial segregation, particularly in the South. One of the ways it did this was by supporting the establishment of sundown towns, which were communities where black people were not allowed to be present after dark, like I mentioned. The KKK often worked in tandem with local police and other vigilante groups to enforce sundown laws and harass black people who were found in these towns after dark. They would use violence, intimidation, and threats to enforce black people out of these communities. And many of these people, their lives were taken from them, and a lot of people were forced to flee for their lives. The KKK's involvement in sundown towns was not limited to the South. However, sundown towns were established in many parts of the country, including the Midwest and the West, like mentioned earlier. And the KKK played a role in promoting and enforcing these laws in many of these communities. Today, the legacy of the KKK's involvement in sundown towns and other forms of racial discrimination continues to affect many communities of color across the United States. It is important to recognize this history and work to create a more just and equitable society, one that recognizes the dignity and worth of all people, regardless of their race and ethnicity. This means fighting against racism and discrimination in all its forms and working to build a more inclusive and welcoming communities for everyone. Sundown towns are still a reality in many parts of the United States, even though they are illegal. These towns are characterized by their exclusionary policies and practices, which are designed to keep people of color out. They were originally established in the early 20th century as a way to maintain white supremacy and to keep black people from voting, owning property, or even passing through. Today, many people of color still experience discrimination and harassment in these communities. This is due to the fact that many of these towns have not changed significantly since their inception, and the attitudes and beliefs that led to their creation are still present in some residents. Additionally, some communities have implemented more subtle forms of discrimination, such as zoning laws and other regulations that make it difficult for people of color to live in certain areas. To address this issue, it is important to raise awareness about the history and legacy of sundown towns and to work to create more inclusive and welcoming communities. Ending sundown towns requires a multifaceted approach that addresses the root cause of segregation and discrimination. This includes addressing housing discrimination, employment discrimination, and unequal access to education and other resources. It also means in creating more inclusive communities that welcome people of all races and backgrounds. By working together to create a more just and equitable society, we can put an end to sundown towns and other forms of racial discrimination. With dedication and perseverance, we can build a brighter future for all people, regardless of their race or ethnicity. With that being said, if you like today's episode and would like more episodes like this, please go ahead and subscribe, share, and comment to let me know you're enjoying the podcast and all of the work and research that goes into it. And if you like me and what I have to say, you can find me over on Twitter at huskasman, lowercase huska, uppercase S, lowercase mini, uppercase T, lowercase hine, and go ahead and follow the official podcast Twitter page at TCN Pod. Everything will be linked down below if you're curious as well. Also, for the Carol case, I didn't want to get into deep because I just didn't want to get into, it felt like it was going to be more exploitative than anything. I just wanted to bring an example of, sundown towns being dangerous. And her case is so famous amongst, the history of sundown towns. So I mentioned it lightly. I did read a little bit off the Wikipedia page, but I will link more. There'll be more sources in the description box if you're interested about her case and everything that surrounding that case. As her second killer was never identified or found out. That was a whole thing that I didn't want to get in because I didn't want to sustainabilize. I can't even speak. Y'all know what I mean. I didn't want to exploit this black woman's death. I didn't want to go into detail about it because I thought it was too much. Me saying that she was stabbed in the heart with a screwdriver, to me, that felt like it was too much, But I did want to bring it up, so there is that. I do have warnings in the beginning of all my podcasts now, so they're just, yeah, if you're listening to this, you probably understand that, this podcast is for an adult and, this is for an older youth and adult audience. This is for people who are able to critically think. So, yeah. Like I said, though, everything will be linked down below in the description box. So if you're interested in where I'm getting all my information, it's always linked. Everything's always linked. And with that being said, I'm hunnasmak at the end, and this has been the Curious Native Podcast.